Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. I'm Paul Muldoon, the poetry editor of The New Yorker, and we're welcoming you here on behalf of the magazine and to this event in the New Yorker Festival. So our topic today with Seamus Heaney is history and homeland. And I'd like to begin, if I may, Seamus, just by taking you back to 1968, which in Ireland, of course, was a year in which the notion of history and homeland somehow combined in rather striking ways.
Well, that was 1968 in October. A civil rights march, you may remember or not, was baton charged by the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Derry City, or Londonderry City, depending which position you take on the homeland in Northern Ireland. And that started off the cycle, I suppose you have to call it, of violence that we experienced between 68 and 1998. And in 1998 we had the Good Friday Agreement, which changed the constitutional arrangements between the Republic of Ireland and the North of Ireland to the extent that there was an acknowledgement that there was a North-South relationship. And then what we now have, we're now 2008, so we're 40 years after that. I remember Conor Cruise O'Brien saying, just after the baton charging of the march, which was the beginning of the action, everybody had a sense that change was going to happen. Civil rights was in the air, civil disobedience, and so on. Conor Cruise O'Brien said, writing, and I think it was in the Listener, this is not a matter of altering some electoral anomaly. This is a matter of changing the relationship between the victorious and the defeated, which the victorious situation established first of all, with the plantation of Ulster in the 1620s, is stabilised, I suppose, with the Protestant settlement of William of Orange in 1690. Then the borders drawn in of the Unionist majority in the north in 1921. And so that was one of the fundamental differences. It wasn't just civil rights, it wasn't just one man, one vote, it wasn't just jobs for no discrimination and so on. It was changing the relationship between that group who thought of themselves as Irish nationalist and out of it, and the group in charge, the caste, if you like, the Northern Unionist caste. And I think those relationships have changed, actually. What the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, whatever you want to call it, in 1998 did was to allow for a perviousness on the border, allow for North-South relationships to be established, institutions to be established, allow for an assembly, an envisaged assembly where the minority, Catholic, Irish, nationalist, whatever you want to call it, would be involved with the British or Unionist majority there. So relationships were made possible. And I think that the 10 years of fumbling around in the Assembly, even though it's just ordinary political, disappointing, fumbling, point scoring and so on, is an advance. So I think we have changed at a great price.
And of course, it's not the kind of thing we see in this country, that kind of fumbling around in the Senate. I realise as you speak there of civil rights, one tends to forget the extent to which the American model in civil rights was really so instructive. Were you conscious of that at the time, or is that something that perhaps you're more aware of since?
Well, we're very, very, very aware of the civil rights movement, of course, in the North, and indeed that model was there for the people who established the actual Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. But I came to California for a very happy year, a very influential year, a very important year, 1970-71. After that, 1969 was really when we moved from protest to danger, and people were killed on the streets, and the British Army was there, and the provost had started, and the sectarian killings that started. It was desolation. But we went to Berkeley then, and I remember one of our friends saying, a black friend, he said, I don't know the words, he said, but I sure recognize the tune. So, but, I mean...
The tune was "We Shall Over." The words were "We Shall Overcome."
That's right. That's
in
right.
both places.
Actually, I remember the first. I wrote a piece in the Listener magazine again, where Conor had written that. The Listener magazine was edited at that time by Carl Miller, very interested in the North. But I ended up my article saying the new Londonderry air. You know, the air Danny Boy is called the Londonderry air or the Derry air. He said the new Londonderry air. It sounds very like "We Shall Overcome." And that was all there. But I have to tell you a story that illustrates the ground on which we were working in 1968 in Belfast. Irish versus British, Catholic versus Protestant, all those kind of underground energies. Very decorous people were with each other, even though it was very high voltage under the decorousness. Anyway, I was on a television program talking about, I think, the North, in the North. And I went for fish and chips in this fish and chip shop near us in Belfast, near Ashley Avenue. And there was a young English woman serving behind the counter. And she said to me, she said, "I recognise you," she said. "You're the Irish poet." And the proprietress, a staunch Orange woman, she said, "He is not an Irish poet. He is a British subject living in Ulster." And then she turned to me and she said, "Wouldn't it sicken you?" And timorously showing my Irish Catholic colour, I said, yeah. But there it was.
Well, there it was. One of the things it was just that celebrity. Yeah. You were writing in the Listener. You were very visible. You were recognised on the street. Was that something that you accepted happily, or how did that work for you?
Well, I grew into it, I suppose. It was a magical arrival in my life of publishing poems. In the 1962, I published two poems in the Belfast Telegraph. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know the literary editor. Sent them in, and they were accepted. Then I moved to higher regions and higher standards.
Now, were they under or over the name Incertus, or was
no,
that they were under your own name?
No, under my own name, Seamus Heaney. My second name is Justin, so when my hair went white, I decided I should be called Justin really, rather than Seamus. I keep thinking of Seamus as a young poet's name, but in the beginning, it was Seamus J. Heaney in the Belfast Telegraph. Then in the Irish Times, I published two poems. The Irish Times published one of them under the name James Heaney, because Seamus is the Irish for James. I never submitted under James, but that was another cultural difference. And then, anyway, 1963, first poems published, 62, 63. 1965, a book accepted by Faber and Faber. Faber's wrote to me. I was really blessed, incredible. And 1966, first book comes out, gets blessings, well received. And I suppose I had a charmed life, and the anxiety that comes with that also. But by 1968, I was teaching in the university. I suppose I felt that I had some kind of representative status for the minority people there. And I was glad enough to write in the Listener and do pieces. But anxious also, because I wasn't an activist. I tried from the beginning to do what Yeats said he tried to do, but this was at the very end. Yeats's formulation was majestic and authoritative, but he said he had tried to hold in a single thought reality and justice. So I tried to write fairly, in other words, as fairly as I could, with giving it a certain tilt.
Let me ask you about the relationship between yourself and the word bawn. You spoke earlier of the plantation. The house that you were brought up in, or the farm that you were brought up in, County Derry or Londonderry again, these words charged in that part of the world, would have been associated with one of these fortified farmsteads. Did that give you any pause at all, or were you conscious of the charge of that when you were growing up?
I was not at all conscious of that when I was growing up. In fact, the place was called Mossbawn, and then it became, when you were writing down the address on your letters, it was a Moss, B-A-W-N. And it was only when, I think 1972, when I came back from Berkeley, I was asked to do, we were always being asked to write something about the conditions in Northern Ireland, explain yourself to the world, and that came to me as an idea for the divided nature of the world we lived in. Mossbawn, B-A-N, B-A long stroke, B-A acute, B-A fada in Irish would mean, Ban would mean white. And it would, if you took it that way, your etymology led you back to native Ulster, to the province known, in the primeval Ireland as Ulla, the Irish language Ulster province. Now, so that is one version of where we live, one homeland, is in what John Montagu called the primal Gaeltacht, the names of many all over the Northern Ireland lead you straight back to pre-Norman, pre-Foundation, pre-Tudor Ireland, to an option of homeland in the first Celtic place, or Gaelic place. So that was Mossbawn. Mossbawn, B-A-W-N, led you to Plantation Ulster, where history begins in the 1620s, and everything before that is not there. The land was theirs before the land was ours, so to speak. And so Mossbawn and Mossbawn, it seemed to me that in the very name of the first house, the division, the problem was implicit etymologically. I don't know which etymology is correct, bon or ban, but they're now commingled, but not problematically, I don't think.
So tell us about Mossbawn. What was it like there?
Well, it's almost like another world, isn't it? I mean, I feel like an anthropologist rather than an autobiographist when I begin to say, it's a whitewashed, single-story, long range of housing. The first 3 rooms, upper room, middle room, lower room, were our dwelling house, thatched roof. But then at the very end, there was a stable and a horse. I mean, in other words, there were four apartments under this one long roof. It was a traditional whitewashed Irish thatched cottage. And very intimate. It was on our own small farm. So only when you get older do you realize that homeland security was there from the beginning. Your own fields were around you. Neighbours that you knew were beside you. It's still a place that in my inner first memory I know best. We moved from that place when I was away at college at the age of 14. But, I mean, I hesitate to mention these things. They're also picturesque, but they're all true. There were wells. People came to our house because we had a pump at the back door to get the water. There was no running water. There was no rural electrification where we lit the lamp. You lit the fire in the morning. You lit the lamp in the evening. Candles were used now and again. So it was the first world. It was a mythic world, if you like. But it was also part of your own ordinary experience. So when I began to write, that place was there, and it still is there. Of course, it's completely changed now. Completely. The thatched house is gone. It's been renovated. The fields, little fields, all the hedges have been taken out. The railway that ran behind our house has been lifted. It's a late 20th century landscape and the roads have changed, and the flax stam I wrote about has been obliterated, and so on. But that doesn't stop me remembering it as it was. No.
Well, there have been changes all over in this country, even over the last 20 years where I live in New Jersey, fantastic changes in the landscape. But somehow the change that took place from, say, 1939, when you were born, over the last 50, 60 years has been quite extraordinary. It's as if one has gone surely from a peasant society to whatever it is we inhabit right now in Ireland. What is it we're inhabiting? This is the first country, by the way, announced the other day, of the European Union which has been declared to be in recession.
It has been declared to be in recession.
It has been declared to be in recession.
That's because we left a week ago. No. Yeah, well, the poet Edwin Muir, who was born in the Orkneys and who ended up in Prague at the communist takeover, who was the first translator of Kafka, he was born into Orkney, into a kind of water in the well, turf cutting, beet cutting, and so on. So he said, culturally, he was born in the Middle Ages. He was born in about the 16th century or 15th century, and then he lived into the into the Soviet era. So he said, chronologically, he was maybe 50 or 60, but culturally, he was about 400 years of age. And I think that applies to us. I mean, we're there, and well, my wife Mary always said that, I mean, we heard this phrase, the Celtic tiger. I don't think that, I now live in the Republic of Ireland, of course, for the last 33 years, where we went there at 72, 36 years. Left the North, lived in the Republic. I felt at home there for many reasons, but when I began to feel less at home, when, this is to say something about me, of course, when the country became very prosperous, I became uneasy. I didn't think it was what we were cut out for somehow. Everybody else seemed to be quite trusting of it, and some part of me, and I think some part of many, many people in the country, relished it, but disbelieved it slightly. So Mary said this Celtic tiger is quite soon going to turn into a rug, she said. And these are the visionary powers of the bride, you see, she came to be right. But we are living in a dismaying moment in Irish history. I mean, we voted no recently to basically saying we are skeptical in some way of our relationship to Europe. We don't believe totally. We didn't ratify by the referendum the Lisbon Treaty. And so that meant that the people spoke no to their previous 30 years of very prosperous history, depending upon Europe, depending upon American investment also, because we had special concessionary, good tax concessions for investments, for corporate investment. And so all of a sudden, the people said no to what they had benefited from. Then suddenly, because of the economic collapse and the housing crisis here and the credit crisis, we're again in world recession. Everything is falling back. The property market is gone. Banks are anxious. Everybody's anxious. So we're in a very strange and dismaying moment, I think, in our history. And the northern crisis now has fallen back into, it's not the worry anymore. It was preoccupying the whole country for 40 years. And now it's economics, you know. So
let's stay with the home place, though, for the moment. So many wonderful poems come out of that experience. Is there any possibility we could have you read one, perhaps? Yes, in the midst of it all.
Yeah. I think the most homeland secure poem maybe I've ever written is a poem called Mossbawn, Sunlight. And what makes us, I mean, it isn't just the address at home. Your own, I mean, when I think of my childhood, how do you think of your childhood? I mean, it's an inwardness. And how do you imagine it? My whole childhood in one way could be summed up. Little fellow in the middle of the field, listening to a lark. I mean, it's very poetic, but it actually is, in a way, the wholeness of that and the littleness of that, the solitude and the at-homeness at the same time, in the whole picture. A lark is very beautiful, very lyric, but it's so the solitude and completeness at once in that image. But the other place, the domestic spot, is the kitchen in the house at Mossbawn. And I do remember stepping out of my cot. I had a cot made by the local carpenter, Joe Ward, and it was made, I suppose, so that if you peed in it, the boards could be taken out and washed, or if you did worse in it, the boards could be taken out and cleaned up. So you could take the bottom out of the cot board by board. And I do remember the sensation of putting my bare foot on the floor and the joy and safety of that. You felt the earth coming up into you. I remember it right in my foot still. So this poem is about being in that kitchen later on. And when I imagined what my security was like, I imagined myself in the cradle. And this poem was written imagining myself in a cradle in that kitchen when my aunt, who lived with us, was baking bread. It's called Mossbawn Sunlight. So there's a griddle which is baking bread, and there's meal, and there's the heat of the stove, and so on and so forth. So, let's see. I've said it before, I say it again. The poem really wants to be a Vermeer, if it could be. Mossbawn Sunlight. There was a sunlit absence. The helmeted pump in the yard heated its iron, water honeyed in the slung bucket, and the sun stood like a griddle cooling against the wall of each long afternoon. So her hands scuffled over the bakeboard. The reddening stove sent its plaque of heat against her, where she stood in a flowery apron by the window. Now she dusts the board with a goose's wing. Now sits broad-lapped with whitened nails and measling shins. Here is a space again, the scone rising to the tick of 2 clocks. And here is love, like a tinsmith scoop, sunk past its gleam in the meal bin. Love situates you all right, that's the other thing.
I've always... sorry, go ahead. I must say that the image that I've always found fascinating among others, and that most fascinating in that poem, is the one of the scone rising to the tick of 2 clocks. And there's some kind of tension between these 2 clocks, which I think actually contributes to the charge of the poem in a way that I don't quite understand, but I think maybe may even appeal to information beyond the poem. Who knows? With the sense of your aunt and your mother in the house. I mean, is there any?
That's very good. I mean, this is a revelation now.
Well, no. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
I'm reassured to know that Jared Manley Hopkins had 2 women in his house too.
Yes, yeah.
I think, yeah. But no, I would say also maybe it's too... There's a poem called Terminus, which I like also, but growing up in between.
Yes.
We all grew up in between in Northern Ireland.
But it's like the 2 societies that you described earlier on, the 2 eras of time. I mean, that's part of the tension.
Well, when the 2 clocks are just physically, I mean, they register that, don't they? I mean, and you used to hear that in old country cottages. It was a much more silent time. That was part of it. So that tick-tock and tick-tock, I mean, they're different melodies. But it's absolutely true that the tension is there too. I thought of it as just safety, but it's safe from something also, I guess. Yeah.
What is the reader who has not heard a clock? I suppose there are some readers in the world who will not have heard a clock in this modern era.
Yeah.
What are they going to make of this?
Well, this is a big test, isn't it? I mean, I remember with Robert Lowell, one of the great poems I loved, I knew it by heart, Man and Wife, tamed by Miltown, we lie on mother's bed. Miltown? What's it? And it was some kind of sedative, I believe, in the 1950s. So, but if the poem is doing its work, it carries you over, I think.
Funnily enough, that's a word I always passed over. I somehow deliberately misread it as Milton, as if they were reading Milton. Your point being that one may actually, in Eliot's phrase, one may, get a poem without entirely understanding it. Richard Eberhardt's great poem about the groundhog, which I loved as a child, which was in every anthology, I realized that, as far as I was concerned, a groundhog was like some kind of wild boar. I had absolutely no idea what a groundhog was, and yet somehow one could get part of the charge of the poem. So when did poetry begin to have a charge for you?
Well, I suppose very early on. I mean, again, I didn't know that these things were poems, but there was a two-liner that we knew as youngsters, which I think is a terrific poem now. Two sticks standing and one across spells Paddy Brennan in the Hillhead Moss. Two sticks standing were in the bog, and there was one across, and on that there was a can hung, and a fire was lit underneath it. And when the guy was in the middle of the day working, he lit his fire and heated up his water and made his tea. He went home in the evening, they were still standing there. There was a sign that the guy had been there. It's a kind of, or they're now saying, Martian poem, a poem about absence, about Stephen Dedalus saying, signals of all things I am here to read, and so on. But that was unconscious, taking in rhymes.
So who wrote that? Did you write that?
That's anonymous.
That's
anonymous. That was just part of the districts.
Mm-hmm.
My granny was Doherty, she was the stuff. She hunted the orange men through Gulladuff. The pretties are boiling for that's a fine joke. The herrings are coming in Doherty's boat. I mean, that was all there. But in school, I remember poetry wasn't actually taught as such. You were given things to learn by heart. And then there were things called comprehension tests, where the poem was read and there were questions to see if you understood the content of the poem. And one of the first poems that meant anything to me was a comprehension test. And in the text was a poem by Wordsworth called Fidelity, a barking sound the shepherd hears, a cry of dog or fox. It was about a famous accident in the Lake District in Wordsworth's time, where some man fell over, a shepherd fell over a precipice, and the dog stayed barking and barking and barking, wouldn't leave the master. So that poem I remember, like everybody else, the first time, again it was a comprehension test, not taught to us. Blake's Tiger, Tiger, Tiger burning bright. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, a well-known Irish poem. But then it was, that was first school. Then secondary school, A-level, English classes, Early on, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it was English teaching where I first got my first frisson. Nothing quite independent about it. It was just doing on the conveyor belt of the education system. And gradually, the older you got, the more conscious you were of your pleasure, the more you were aware of what was involved. I mean, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Wordsworth meant a lot to me, Keats and so on. Then at university, Elizabethan Jacobean drama, John Webster, etc., etc. And then Yeats, oddly enough, in my 20s, really. I mean, I read 3 or 4 poems by Yeats at university, but he didn't take them in. So it was only when I began to write that I began to read other poets like Yeats with avid interest, not just in their work, but in their conduct and how they behaved themselves and how they got through their life in a society, particularly Mr. Yeats. Yeah.
And the Americans?
The Americans are very important to me in the university. I always remember John Crowe Ransom, I knew by heart, Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Frost was completely important. You know, when I met him at university, and then when I had, as I said, a charmed life. My poetry was published early, and as a result, I was given a job. I was upwardly mobile from primary school into teacher training college. It maybe came too easy. I felt I had to earn it later on, to tell you the truth. I came right up into, and I was teaching in Queen's University when Paul Muldoon himself arrived in the university as a. So I was teaching Frost, I think, in the university before I really knew him well enough. I was a young fellow. So all that came quickly, magically, eagerly, and as you know, we're still learning to read the poets we love. I'm still learning to read Yeats and Frost and Bishop and Lowell. And, you know, I was very lucky to meet Lowell in Ireland also, and Ted Hughes was very important to me as a stay, as a kind of something foundational. I read his poetry in 1962. I came across Ted Hughes' poetry in the Belfast Library. I came across it first, I think, in the Alvarez's anthology, The New Poetry, and it sent a charge into me. His subject matter was like what I had grown up with. I thought that my stuff wasn't really there for modern poetry. It was kind of bulls and thatched cottages and wells and so on. But Hughes had this mythic sense of the animals, and that all that was a charge of energy and a confirmation that you could use your own material.
And a sense too, which I think you developed, of a relationship in Ted Hughes between his poetry and indeed his personage and the country itself. Yes. One of the reasons I think why he was such a spectacularly successful poet laureate, having to do with his relationship with some sense of England. And that's an idea that I think may have come partly from Yeats in the case of Hughes, but also in your own case perhaps from Yeats, the sense that, as he put it, somehow along these lines, that Ireland was a country in which one man or woman, presumably he would have said, had he been circumspect, can take a project and see it through in the course of his or her lifetime. Do you have a sense that the project of being a poet who, as we've discussed earlier, who in some way represents Ireland, is still one that's viable?
Well, I should say I didn't start out thinking I represented Ireland at all.
Right.
But in a small way, during those crisis years that you're asked to be spokesperson and so on. So there was that element. The moment when I thought something happened good, the first book is full of first-person singular. And there is a poem in the second book called Bogland, where there's a we, and it is the people of the island, you know. I thought of the island of Ireland. The way we were taught about it at school was that Ireland was like a saucer. It had mountains around the edges, and then there was a wet bit in the middle. People used to wet their saucers in Ireland in the middle, spill their tea into the saucer. But so I wrote this poem called Bogland because the bog of Allen was in our teaching. We were all taught that. I'm sure your school too. The centre was wet. So I did this poem quickly, thank goodness, like many of the best ones. And in my university, I had to teach a class for Michael Allen, who taught American literature, and he was off for a day or two. And I had to say something about American literature, and I learned this most primitive of truths, that in America the prairie is very important and the frontier is very important, and that is their myth. So after I taught that class, I thought, well, what's ours? I mean, Americans have this terrific outward direction finding, pushing out. We have a bog going down. So that and there's a kind of pun on the word pioneers, where the first meaning of that is the people in the army who dig the holes in the trenches. So they're the diggers, the pioneers, and they're the people in the covered wagons here, I guess. Oh, here. I think I know it by heart, but I better get it all the same.
Do you, from time to time, recite a poem from memory? Or?
I do, quite often. This one usually, yeah.
No, it's interesting because we were talking earlier on about how we learn poetry at school. I was beaten into it, and yet somehow one perhaps doesn't always have...
Well, I've read this one fairly often in my time. So yeah. Bogland. We have no prairies to slice a big sunlit evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up, an astounding crate full of air. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered, salty and white. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here, only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. Our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet centre is bottomless. I was very glad when that happened.
The central idea of history in that poem and a number of others has to do with what we keep, what we hold on to, what's preserved, what might serve us from generation to generation. It occurs to me that perhaps right now in Ireland and perhaps in this part of the world also, that there may be some aspects of our history that we have to shrug off, leave behind, reinvent.
Yes.
And I want to ask you about the phrase hope as it combines with the word history, a phrase you use at the end of one of your translations, and a phrase that's been taken up by one of the main players, I suppose, in those 40 years of engagement in Northern Ireland, that's to say Gerry Adams, as the title of his autobiography. A phrase that one might well imagine that other great Irishman, Barack Obama, taking up as a rallying cry. Tell us about hope and history, and if part of what hope might be about isn't, in fact, leaving off some stuff.
Well, the phrase came up in a chorus I wrote for a translation of Philoctetes, or I'm never sure whether to say Philoctetes or Philoctetes.
I think both will be
Both
will be okay in this present company. I think.
Does it rhyme with Socrates or Sweeties? I think. Yeah.
I think
anyway,
one's heard both. Philoctetes.
Philoctetes. And I changed the title of it to The Cure at Troy, and it's a play where it has in a sense a happy ending. The man who refuses to go back, Philoctetes was marooned on Lemnos on their way to. The Greeks were going to Troy to take the city, and Philoctetes ended up with they stopped there and he got bit, and his feet became stinking. He became a rotten smelling guy, and they said, well, you stay here, we'll finish with you. So they maroon him and they go on to Troy, and he's there for 10 years, deeply embittered. Then a prophet says, you need Philoctetes to take Troy. So the story was, he has to come back. He has to, in a sense, forgive them, which he won't. But at least in the Greek drama, you had a way of bringing a god in to say to Philoctetes, forget it, buddy. You go to Troy no matter what. Deus ex machina. So we had no way of swinging a god in out of the Guildhall roof. So I had to write a chorus that that said, get on the... But I added an extra chorus to this play. I had been reading Václav Havel, one of his books of interviews. And in this interview, he made a distinction between optimism and hope. And that was precisely what was called for in our country. Anybody born and bred in Northern Ireland could not be too optimistic. We're not going to say, oh, it'll be terrific, it'll turn out well, That optimism is, yeah, it'll be grand, it'll be all right. No. Hope said Havel, is not optimism. It isn't grounded on the notion that everything will turn out well. Hope is, its horizon is beyond the actual. It's a transcendent thing. Hope means that you believe something is worth working for and is worth sticking at, worth persisting with. So in that sense, hope became an allowable concept. We are all very wary in the north of Ireland of being too optimistic or putting too good a face on things, not because knowing the difficulty to go back to the beginning of re-establishing relationships between conquered and defeated is not a simple thing. Anyway, I wrote this chorus, and it says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then actually I should say, this, I would never have allowed myself to do this, Paul, had it not been 1990. This was the year after 1989, when everything had happened. The wall had come down in Berlin. All things had happened in Poland, Czechoslovakia. Nelson Mandela had come out of Robben Island. So the Václav Havel thing was allowable to oneself, although it was a very fierce time, very unhopeful in the north of Ireland in the early 90s. Very cruel, a lot of killing in Derry and Grey Steel and all those things. Anyway, history says don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. That was the crucial stanza. And as I say, it was underwritten by what had happened in Europe and by what was happening in South Africa and what could possibly happen on our own ground. So,
though I doubt even then you had an image of Ian Paisley and
absolutely none.
And Martin McGuinness holding hands.
The Chuckle Brothers, as they were called in the north. No dream of that.
But that was an astonishing moment. I mean, was quite remarkable.
It was. And that would never be forgotten. It marked things. But it was a mark of possibility, I think. We've gone back to, I think there was definitely progress after 1998. We had moved from the atrocious to the messy, which is an advance. And with Martin and Ian, there was a kind of, again, it's a symbol of hope, that this thing was worth working for. Slip back a bit now to grimmer realities and positioning and,
Let me ask you about that. I mean, there have been moments when I've wondered, for example, if there wasn't... I've always taken it pretty much at face value, the notion that hope and history might rhyme. And it's been quoted so often, including, I think, by Bill Clinton when he came to visit Ireland, and on other occasions, I think, by many people. I sometimes wonder if there might not be a slightly ironized component to it, in the sense that hope and history can never, strictly speaking, rhyme at all. And I wonder if... talk about the word rhyme, would you, in that context? What does it mean for you?
Well, I go back to the end of the Philoctetes. It was interesting. This was quoted when after Hilary and Bill were in Dublin in 1995. They were taking their farewells. And the last chorus of the Curate Troy says, now It's time to part anyway. And it ends up, the word leave occurs. They're leaving. And then the last line is in the half-true rhyme is love, you see. And I wasn't sure for a long time whether to call it, say, the true half-rhyme is love, or the half-true rhyme is love.
That's the infants of Philip Larkin.
I know, they're half true.
Yeah.
No, but I think half rhyme is a technically complete thing.
Yes.
So if I said the true half rhyme is love, it's completely optimistic in a way.
That's wonderful. So in other words, love rhymes with hope. Is that
no? Love rhymed with leave earlier on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please forgive me.
This was in an earlier.
I have a very loose sense of what a half rhyme is.
No, but I'm saying that the question of rhyme and the question of truth and true rhyme and half rhyme. The first problem I had was in the first play, the first Greek version. I wasn't sure whether to end up with the true half rhyme is love or the half true rhyme is love. I ended up opting for the half true rhyme as being more cautious. And open history, well, that was a chorus, and I would never allowed myself that kind of writing in propria persona.
See, I think that makes a lot of sense, but that's not necessarily how it's read. I think that component is not really part of how it's read. And the half-true... The
half-true rhyme is love. Now it's high water mark in time. But anyway, the end of this play has them leaving the island. And leave is the first word in the rhyme couplet, and then love is the second rhyme. So it's a half rhyme. Anyway, we've laboured this one, maybe.
Well, you know, I think we are going to have to draw to a close at that point, and one can't imagine a better moment, if I may suggest. The poet who, to go back to Yeats, of all poets, I think, writing in English at the moment, who really has managed to himself remake. Seamus Heaney is going to end this wonderful occasion with a poem. So, Seamus.
Robin was asked for a poem. It's in memory of a mutual friend who was an exemplary figure, a free spirit who knew everything about the captured society he was in. Sean Armstrong was his name. He was sprung from, you would say, a Protestant or Unionist tradition. Really, these words have to be used. But he ended up in working as a social worker, moving across the two communities from Shankill Road to the other side, and he was a social worker. After leaving Queens, he was in a commune in California, spent a while in Sausalito, and came back and hoped to establish a commune in County Fermanagh, I think, down Lough Erne. Anyway, he was shot. And he actually was the person whose party Mary and I attended on the first night we took ourselves seriously. So there's a kind of happy moment there too. But it's about rattling, unoptimistic, but trusting, hopeful Ulster. A postcard from North Antrim begins with one of those 19th century postcards in memory of Sean Armstrong. A lone figure is waving from the thin line of a bridge of ropes and slats slung dangerously out between the cliff top and the pillar rock. A 19th century wind, dulce pickers, sea campions. A postcard for you, Sean. And that's you, swinging alone, antic, half afraid, in your gallow-glasses beard and swallowtail of serge, the Carrick-a-Reed rope bridge, ghost-written in sepia. Or should it be your houseboat, ethnically furnished, redolent of grass, remember the grass smoking? Should it be your houseboat, redolent of grass? Should we discover you beside those warm-planked democratic wharves among the twilights and guitars of Sausalito? Drop out on a comeback, prince of no man's land, with your heads in clouds or sand. You were the clown social worker of the town, until your candid forehead stopped a point-blank tea-time bullet. Get up from your blood on the floor. Here's another boat in grass by the loch shore. Turf smoke, a wired hen run, your local hoped-for, unfound commune. Now recite me William Bloat. Sing of the Calabar or of Henry Joy McCracken who kissed his Mary Ann on the gallows at Cornmarket, or Ballycastle Fair. Give us the raw bar. Sing it by brute force if you forget the air. Yet something in your voice stayed nearly shut. Your voice was a harassed pulpit, leading the melody it kept at bay. It was independent, rattling, non-transcendent Ulster, old decency and old bushmills, soda farls, strong tea, new rope, rock salt, kale plants, potato bread and woodbine. Wind through the concrete vents of a border checkpoint. Cold zinc nailed for a peace line. 15 years ago, come this October, crowded on your floor, I got my arm round Mary's shoulder for the first time. "Oh, Sir Jasper, do not touch me," you roared across at me, chorus leading, splashing out the wine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.